Hello, everyone. Welcome to Quantum Catechesis. I'm Father Joe Krupp, and you are not. And I don't know what day it is because Dr. Aaron and I have climbed into a time machine. Carrie is driving. And we are at some point in the future, or as they say in Spanish, el futuro, which is Spanish for the futuro. We are beginning a section now with one of my friends, a new friend to me, and Dr. Aaron Walter, who is in Czechoslovakia. No, you're not in Czechoslovakia anymore. You're in Lithuania.
No, I'm in Lithuania.
Yeah, Vilnius, right? I mean,
that's correct.
Yeah, and he is he's the man. So what we're gonna do is dedicate some episodes now to the modern state of Israel. I think I've given you guys some good stuff on the ancient state of Israel, the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom, all that craziness. But what he's going to do now is walk us through the modern situation, which kind of began in 1948, but really began with the pogroms in Europe way back in the day. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce Dr. Aaron, and then we're just going to go. Now, we'll divide this up so the endings to an episode might end up being abrupt, right? Just know that. He and I and Carrie just decided we're just going to talk it through. And we hope you find this helpful and edifying. And one of the things I'll invite us to do, if we have strong opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, to rely on experts, not the people who sell news, but the people who've studied the issue and really powered through it. So we pray the Lord help us put away any biases or anti-Arab or anti-Jew sentiment, and instead simply ask ourselves the most important question a human can ask. What's true? What's true? So with that, I would like us to give a warm quantum catechesis welcome to Dr. Aaron Walters. Walter. I always say Walter.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Brother, we're so happy you're here. Now, before we launch the missile, which is an ironic phrase to use when discussing the Middle East, now that I think about it. So
that is true.
Yeah, anyone listening from the state of Iran, that is a turn of phrase. Okay. So, brother, could you give folks, I know your list of credentials is 3 miles long, so if you want, just focus on your Israeli credentials, or just give us a sense, bro, of where we can be comfortable accepting you as a professional academician on this topic.
Okay, so I think there's the best way to say that is I have my PhD. Is in international relations. My specialty is U.S. foreign policy towards Israel.
Nice.
And over the last probably 13 years, I have been teaching courses in Israeli studies. So dealing with Israeli foreign policy, yes, U.S. foreign policy, looking at security issues in the Middle East, national security for both countries.
Sure.
I teach actually a course on that. I also teach a course on just like the politics aspect of it, the leaders, how American presidents and how Israeli prime ministers, how they get along and maybe how they don't get along, and what's in the news and it's really nice that you led into this by saying, you know, where's the truth or where's the facts, you know, because so much of it is maybe media narrative driven.
Yes.
So I try to get to the core of a lot of these little topics or kind of the subject matter in my courses. First time that I went to Israel was in 2012.
Okay.
I've been to Israel several times already, and actually kind of all over.
Yeah.
Now what's interesting is because though I'm not Jewish, I'm Catholic. But I've actually never gone on one of those like Christian Catholic pilgrimages.
Yeah.
You know, like as a pilgrim, I've never gone like that. All my time going to Israel has always been like kind of work related. I've been going to conferences.
Oh, sure.
I've been in Haifa. I've been in the Negev. You know, I've been all these other. But it's always been. Those are the reasons why I've been going. or for research. It's never been like, oh, I'm going to go, to the holy sites. So one time, I think it was back in 2017 and 2018, I did go, and it was like, I thought, all right, I'm going to go half for work, and then the other half I'm just going to
sure.
be that pilgrim and be that tourist. Yeah. So that's
cool.
That's kind of how best I can introduce myself, and
sure.
What I think, and I think we're going to talk about, at least what I hope we can get to in these kind of series of videos, is really what I do, what I read, what I talk about, the questions I answer, the thesis topics that I help my students as they're preparing their bachelor and master type of like big diploma type of papers. So and of course in the best possible way to answer your questions that you might have or that our listeners might have, that we'll be bringing it in. So I'm super excited. I think
me too, bro.
I was more nervous to think about this one. Not nervous, but I was like more excited about this one than in the previous ones about Ukraine, because it's like, all right, now like that's also kind of in our wheelhouse of what we read and what we know, and what at least also topics and subjects that I teach. But this one is really close and dear to my heart. So I'm excited. So let's get started.
And for me, bro, my credentials are minor at best, right? I did a semester in Israel. I stayed with 3 kinds of people, right? I stayed with some of the Catholic missions there, right? But that was the shortest amount of time. I stayed with Palestinian Christian families, and I stayed with Jews. And all of that was an effort to get us to see both what's complicated and what is not at all complicated, right? Which our prof kept saying that to us. He said, there's elements of this struggle that are ridiculously complicated, but there's more that are not, which I found fascinating insight. And I was so hooked by my experience there that I read way too much, right? It was just one of those things. I think I told you the first book I read on the modern situation in Israel was O Jerusalem by Dominique Lapierre, which was a really crazy thorough breakdown of the war for the right to exist in like 1950. I know an embarrassing amount about that. But when I looked at the amazing outline you sent me, I was like, oh, I can't wait, right? Because the little I know excites me, but be this as it may, if you're okay, I'll start with a statement that will lead into a question. And if the statement is incorrect, I need you to correct me, right?
All right.
So I did a podcast, you may remember, on the history of anti-Semitism, right? And I talked extensively about the pogroms that plagued Jews in Europe for about 1,300 years. For those who did not hear that podcast, obviously I recommend it because I made it, but that sounds so weird to say, right? But pogroms were, for lack of a better phrase, organized and semi-organized purges of Jews. And these were so commonplace in all over Europe, except for Poland, which Poland just rocked the free world when it came to the treatment of Jews. But everybody else would have these pogroms where usually it would start on Good Friday, unfortunately. And they would run out, just round up Jews, burn down their houses, steal their stuff, kill, rape, pillage. And the word there is pogroms. It's just like the word program, but without the first R. So I think the smartest thing, this is my opinion, but correct me, is to say what Hitler did was simply a culmination of what Europeans had been doing for about 1,300 years. He did it with German efficiency. and with evil focus. Well, all of it's evil, but you know what I mean. And at the end of World War, and at the end of World War II, slowly the West started going, what? Right? The U.S. did not, for the most part, have any sense that this was just a part of life. And when Ravensbrück and Auschwitz and Sobibor and all these other camps were liberated, and then the Nuremberg trial started, what the world, in my opinion, again, correct me if I'm wrong, started to realize is what Jews knew for about 1,300 years. We have no place we can live where we are safe.
Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that was like the majority like light bulb moment for everyone, because there was a sizable minority of we say Christians, or maybe kind of pro. There was no Israel at the time, but like maybe pro-Jewish settlement homeland type of movers and shakers.
Zionism.
In Western, Zionist, in Western Europe, or even in the United States, that had already come to this conclusion. But again, they're still in the minority, but yet there's a sizable amount of them, to have that. I think the larger comment would be that for Jews, particularly assimilated Jews in Western Europe and the United States, this is where they come to that realization.
Yes.
For a large part of them, we got the Dreyfus affair, and I'm sure you covered that in there. But that was that was huge because it was France, right? We're not talking about Russia. We're not talking about someplace in who knows, we can't pronounce it. This is France. So all the way back in enlightened France, of the Belle Epoque, type of time period. Yes. So to have the most liberal European country at that time, treat one of their assimilated that way, because they could, and because he was Jewish.
He's a Jew.
That I think that really kind of set off the alarm bells, and of course it launched Theodor Herzl and others to really look for a place where Jews could be safe.
Yeah, Eretz Israel, right, had been in the consciousness of Jews for God knows how long, right? The craving to get home. That's how it was taught to me.
But there was still such a large percentage of Jews themselves that had assimilated. This is where the Shoah, or the Holocaust, as we would call it. But it was so devastating for European Jewry because such a huge amount of them just couldn't believe that it actually was going to happen, or that it was happening, because they had assimilated. There was a large section of the European Jewry that had assimilated to the culture, not only to the language, but to the various levels of professionalism.
Sure.
Pre World War II. So for them to suddenly feel like, well, we're being persecuted and we now need to leave, it took this catastrophic event for them to realize, okay, nowhere really is safe.
Yeah.
And now we have to look somewhere else. One of the myths, or one of the misunderstandings, is that there were no Jews living in Palestine, or living in that territory. I mean, when the Ottomans took over, it was called the Ottoman Palestine. Then when the British took over following the First World War, and they held on to it during the Second World War, and afterwards it's called British Mandate Palestine. But one of these myths is that there were no Jews there.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Yeah.
But there was. There was about 10% of the population during that time frame of, let's say, about 40 years. If we want to say from 1900, but I mean, we could all go back maybe the start of the 20th century. But regardless, about 10%, 10%
Yeah.
of the population there was Jewish. And they had roots there. And interesting enough, there was a degree and level of coexistence with the
Oh yeah.
Arabs which was quite shocking, if we think of it in today's, today's headlines. But that's something that should probably be cleared up right away, that there were already Jews there. So it wasn't like, okay, now all the Jews suddenly decide to come.
Right.
That wasn't the case.
Yeah, and for those unfamiliar, just real quick, a review. What Dr. Aaron's talking about, Dr. Walter, is so Rome obviously conquered that area and held it, and then the Ottomans, and again, I'm skipping years and years and years, then the Ottomans held it, and the Jews who lived there had to pay a tax because they weren't Muslim, and so did the Christians, right? And in exchange for paying the tax, they could have relative peace, fair treatment, other such thing. And then the Ottomans sided with the Germans, and so after World War I, the Brits took over that area, and as Dr. Aaron pointed out, they called it British Mandate Palestine. Palestine from the Emperor Hadrian's word for it, when he did the first real effort to purge Jews. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, 3rd century, somewhere in there, A.D. In fact, to this day, religious Jews, if you say Hadrian, they respond, "May his bones be crushed." Did you know that, bro? Isn't that a riot?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, nobody can hold a grudge like Middle Easterners, be they Jews or Arabs or Christians. They can hold a grudge. So what Dr. Aaron's pointing out is just that kind of real quick run through that the whole time Jews lived there. In varying numbers and degrees. It wasn't that in 48 all of a sudden a crap ton of Jews just poured into what we call Israel now. There were Jews there. Always. I mean, literally always. Since the time of really Jehu, way back in the time of King David,
Yeah, and I should say that I have read some accounts where the native Jewry were not particularly pleased after World War II with suddenly this influx of European and American Jewry, because it was like, what are you doing here? So it's very, very.
And all the disputes right away among the Jews, among each other in what we call Israel about what language are we going to speak? No one knew what the heck. There was no language to unite them. Ben-Gurion hadn't reinvented Hebrew, as it were. But it's kind of funny.
Yeah, and for a sizable, a sizable minority, but this time of the Jews there, especially those that were coming from kind of Eastern Europe, or had immigrated to the U.S. but were from Eastern Europe originally, and now were coming. So they did share Yiddish. That was what they were able to hear and understand and even speak it. But it would be drastically different, if suddenly you've got a Eastern European Jew who's gone and he's there with a guy, a Jew who's been living there for generations,
We're
and
then
they meet somebody from. I was just going to say, and then they meet somebody from Morocco, or from Iraq, or from Iran, and it's like, well, because there were huge, sizable Jewish communities in these countries as well, but they wouldn't know. Yeah, they didn't know Yiddish, so they wouldn't be able to understand each other.
So we get
lots of cool stories that I heard just in terms of, but also in terms of the social structure, because there were so many immigration waves that came, but you would end up having the housewives, as these quote unquote housewives, as they're waiting in line for their weekly ration of the butter or the salt or the flour or whatever. But you have somebody that's didn't know any better. Well, clearly we're from either rich or from upper middle class, somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the U.S. And then they immigrated, and they're next to somebody who clearly would have been considered poor or the lower, kind of lower spectrum of the social ladder, and that was a flattener. Basically when they all showed up after the Second World War, and really helped create the state of Israel after declaring its independence in '48, winning that war, that lasted for about a year and a half. It was a flattener because it was like everybody starting from zero, basically.
So, brother,
yeah, a lot of fun little stories about that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, then let's jump into, is it 47, the partition plan, where
Yes,
the UN is, I think they were at Lake Placid in New York. The UN was meeting, I think, and what was going on is, and it's hard for people to understand, it's hard for me to understand, when we say 6 million dead Jews in Eastern Europe, if you look at the population of Europe, I mean, 6 million is an obscene amount of people. It's more obscene in the 1940s. There just weren't that many more Jews died in the Holocaust than didn't in that area. So no one was ready for this. And now they decide we're doing this partition plan. Is this a good way to start that?
Yeah, it's a good way. I think it's the most simple way, because there's so much still the backstory there, but I think this is the most simple way to bring it up, because it's probably the most truthful. The United Nations, they're new.
Yeah.
Right. They've been built on the corpses of the League of Nations.
Yeah.
And they've been given a gigantic task by the last kind of gasps of the superpower, which is the United Kingdom at this time, which is, well, you deal with it, because we don't want to be there anymore. We've lost too many guys fighting guerrilla fights against the Arabs and the Jews. They're bleeding us with our money, and we just can't afford it. I mean, that's the simple truth. Britain could not afford to be there to administer that part of the world anymore. So they were looking at a way to offload this problem,
right,
and let's give it to the UN. And so the UN now is given a hot potato, to use this great idiom, because immediately upon the British wanting to leave, it stirs up all of the angst on both sides, because, surprise, surprise, as any good superpower does, they promise both sides the same thing throughout the decades. And the British had promised both the Arabs and the Jews a homeland, though they were, not exactly specific as to where that territorial boundaries would be. So they give this hot potato to the UN. The UN General Assembly creates a very special committee on Palestine. They send a bunch of delegates to the area to have a look, to talk to the people that are living there, and they come up with what they think is the most reasonable, which is we'll cut the country in two. We'll cut the land in two, and we're going to have a state of Palestine and a state of Israel, and we're going to have Jerusalem and part of Bethlehem connected to it, but that would be kind of an administrative area, and everything should be fine, right? Everybody should be happy. The Jews were definitely not happy with this, because from their perspective, this was a long fulfilled promise of actually having a homeland, and the homeland would be all of the land, not just like a part of it. And the Arabs weren't happy, because they also had been promised all of the land, or at least how they interpreted it to be all of the land. So, but what they look at, and this is very interesting, how David Ben-Gurion, he becomes the first Israeli prime minister, but he's the leader of the provisional government in 47. So it's like a state without a state yet. And he is the leader, and he has his meetings with his ministers, or at least with his advisors, and he makes the argument, this is the best time for us to do this. It might not ever come back again, especially if we say no. And at least having like half of a state is better than no state. This is his sentiment. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing a lot of what that internal discussion was. So they accept the partition plan. The Arabs, they don't.
Right.
And this kind of, again, it's hindsight. A lot of scholars, a lot of historians, like, well, if only if they would have. But I don't know. I still think there would have been some form of disagreement between the Arabs that were living there and Jews also that were living there, that the UN would have to have solved later on, or we would maybe still be kind of dealing with, because it fundamentally comes to this question of, do we have one state? Do we have two states? If we're going to have two states, where exactly is that territory? If it's based upon demographics, well, it's all spread out based upon different Arab villages that are next to Jewish villages. Not discussed too much in Europe or even in the U.S., but really when we talk about demographics, we're talking about moving people.
Yeah.
Moving people from homes because, well, suddenly you are on the other side of the line.
Yeah.
And the closest kind of analogy.
If you don't mind, Doc, one of our
Sure.
profs said it this way: this isn't an American moving from his home. This isn't, well, we bought this house in 1983 and we're going to sell it in 1993. This is my great-grandfather's grandfather's grandfather bled and fought to have this plot of land.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what we have. But yes, the United Nations, they came up with what they considered at that time the best solution, which was to partition, to split the land. The provisional government under David Ben Gurion accepts this. The Arabs they don't, and it's not to say that there was one specific leader. I think that's
right.
Another kind of misunderstanding. Now we have, within Israel, when they're dealing with Palestinians, there's kind of the Palestinian president. That's Mohammed Abbas. Before that, it was Yasser Arafat. But even today, there's a split between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, which they control the Gaza Strip. But back then, it was very, very much a land that Egypt claimed, that Jordan, but they're also being called Transjordan at this particular point in time, that they're claiming, Syria's claiming, part of this, and even there's voices within Lebanon, but the big heavy shakers and movers are Syria and Jordan and Egypt. And they're basically saying, well, no, it should be part of us, part of whatever our territory would be. And this leads then into, we've got Israel taking that additional step, then saying, okay, we agree with the partition plan, and we are going to then declare ourselves independent, and we're going to now have an actual homeland. We've ancestrally had this homeland. It's biblical as well. Our roots are here, but now we're actually going to have a modern democratic state in the Middle East. And the Arab neighbors that kind of refuse to recognize this, then we have to lead into the first Arab-Israeli war from 48 to 49.
And I think, brother, if for God's people listening, just in a nutshell, you got to remember, for lack of a better phrase, you have these Jews that agreed to the partition, and then you have the Arabs who didn't. Well, why lean toward the Jews? What I was taught was, well, the Arabs were on the wrong side of World War I and World War II, and this is simply part of that reality. And that
no, I wouldn't say that, though, Father.
Okay.
It would, the Hashemite kingdom, which is Jordan,
right?
So King Hussein, but his tribe was the largest in that area, and we're going. I mean, now we're going pre-World War I.
Yeah,
but there was a lot of promises, and I think that's the thing. It wasn't that they sided with one side and they lost in wars. This was very similar to the Jews. They had been promised by Western powers, by the British, by the French, time and time again, land.
Yeah.
To have actually control over the territory there. And so it was a deep, deep-seated sense of betrayal.
Yeah.
so it wasn't a, you can say, well, were they particularly, at that moment in history, were they prudent? If they would have said yes, would history be different? Yes, it would be different, but we don't know what it would look like nowadays. But
Could be worse.
Be different, of course.
Yeah.
It could be worse, could be better. They weren't particularly prudent, but they were coming from a point of deep-seated resentment and bitterness. I mean, for those of you that are watching, I would really highly recommend 2 books and a movie.
Okay.
But the movie's based, of course, on the book. But the book is called 1948. It's by Dr. Benny Morris.
Okay. I have not read that, fantastic.
Bro. No, you have? Okay.
No. So
he's an Israeli historian, but he has really kind of lived and breathed this. This was a huge chunk of his early scholarship and his early work, and he researched it really well. So it's not biased.
Oh, like praise God.
You get a pretty good balanced perspective of and it's not just the big cities, of what's going on during the war or leading up to the war and then after the war. He goes into like these tiny villages of Arabs that are right next to Jews, and how are the relationships between the 2 villages or between the people there and whatnot. It's really good.
I can't wait, bro.
I more highly recommend it. Benny Morris, Morris, and I think it's called 1948. Just that's the title of the book.
I got
Benny
you,
Morris
bro.
For sure. You get it. Really, T.H. Lawrence, right? Lawrence of Arabia, but his book about this time really is good from the point of view of a Westerner who totally gets into the Arab mentality and the Arab opinion on the topic. I mean, he was involved after World War One. At the Versailles Conference.
And is the book Lawrence of Arabia?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you, bro.
It's the same name as the movie.
Okay.
But he goes a bit more into. I mean, the book obviously you get to hear his thoughts, his opinions, and why, and so forth. So we get this idea where the Arabs weren't necessarily prudent. Why not? Because there was this idea that we were promised something, and no, why should we compromise? You're again, outside external forces are requiring us to compromise.
Okay.
And we've compromised enough. We've already said next time.
Yes.
And we don't want to do that anymore. We want it. We want what we should be, deserving of ours, right? We didn't like the Ottomans, even though they were Arabs, but we didn't like how they were treating us because we weren't, slaves. We didn't like the British. Yeah. We don't particularly like the French if we're talking about the Syrian Arabs that were there. So we want ours.
This is really helpful, bro.
I think that's a good understanding
I
as
do
to
too.
why, in that particular moment in time, they said no.
Yeah. This is great. Yeah.
Yeah, which leads into then we've got the war, which is
horrific.
The state of Israel, they announce themselves independent, and immediately they're invaded. Yes. They're invaded by Egypt. They're invaded by Jordan. They're invaded by Syria, and at that particular time, it seemed like, okay, fortune favors not only the bold, but also fortune favors the numbers. Yeah. You've got, basically 3, 4, some historical accounts maybe would say 5, depending on, where the armies are coming from, but they're invaded. Yeah. And the idea is not, we're going to win this war and then we will have some kind of peace or settlement with the Jews. This is sadly enough where I think a lot of that resentment is the seeds are planted. Yeah. And the long held stereotypes and prejudices also kind of take root here, because this is the idea of we're going to roll the Jews back to the sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to take the land. We're going to take basically what was promised to us but not delivered to us. And the simple fact then that, as the Jews would probably say, miracle of miracles, they don't lose, but they win. This is just shocking, and it's unthinkable to the Arab leaders, to the Arabs themselves, and helps kind of undercoat a little bit this narrative. Well, how could we lose? How did we lose this?
Do you mind if I want to make an effort to summarize that war? And you correct whatever I get that's wrong, right?
Okay.
I've read a lot about it, but again, I don't know enough to know if my sources are pure. So, for example, just what you said about that Jordanian perspective, I never heard that. Do you know that? I never heard that. And then, of course, when you're saying it, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course that's true. I remember reading about all these promises to the but he's how I understand.
Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot. This is Sykes, and he's writing letters to well, he's not King Hussein, he's just the leader. Yeah. But there's a correspondence of letters, which is saying, help us overthrow the Ottomans, and then we'll give you the land. Yeah. And at this end, So here's how I understand the war in a nutshell. The Israelis had 3 significant problems besides being wildly outnumbered, right? One, they didn't have a language to unite them. I remember reading a book by a West Point grad, an American general who left the American military to go fight with the Jews because he was a Jew. And he was like, these people, I can't get them to do anything because none of us can understand each other. I've got to yell the orders in English, and then someone yells them in German, someone yells them in Polish, someone yells them in French. And he was talking about all these problems. And so that was an issue for them, too. They didn't have a military. They were literally stuffing nails and things in garbage cans, lighting them on fire and lobbing them, and that was their artillery. Right? And then the other problem was, of course, the Arab armies had everything but basically Jerusalem in about an hour. I mean, I'm, of course, way exaggerating, right? And then what the Jews had going for them is that this was a war of extinction. If they lose, there are no Jews left in Europe. Right? It's how they saw it. It's a huge motivating factor when a sizable portion of your fighting force either have just survived, the death camps, or are related to somebody who did or who did not. This is a big.
In the book,
that war. Yeah.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, real quick, unless you already know this blew me away. The book was pointing out, so the Arabs blockaded everything but Israel, Jerusalem, and the Palmach would try to smash supplies into Jerusalem at about a 70% casualty rate. And the 30% that would get into Jerusalem, they said by the end of the last 6 months of the siege of Jerusalem, people were subsisting on a half a piece of bread and 6 ounces of water. And when they were talking to him afterward, they were like, how did you survive? Literally, they had people who said, that's more than I've eaten since World War II started. Right? We survived death camps. A half a piece of bread and 8 ounces of water? We would have died for that at Auschwitz. Right? That you just had this bizarrely, and that's so awful to say, but they were like, no, this ain't bad. I mean, it's awful, but it's not Auschwitz. Right?
Yes.
And then you had a lot of infighting because the Arabs' goal wasn't just to kill the Jews, it was to get that land for themselves. And so there was some infighting. So that's how I heard it.
It's right. The only thing I would probably, I'm not going to correct you because there's no correction, but I think it's important to clarify a little bit that when the British left, they left.
Yeah, they just abandoned shit.
But they didn't take everything.
Right.
So it was like a free-for-all in terms of military hardware equipment that both the Arabs are going after and
The
the Jewish
Irgun and the
militia,
Stern Gang.
like
Yeah.
exactly, like these little paramilitary groups that existed, Haganah, which all of it gets put together, and then we have the IDF, but these little paramilitary groups, I mean, little in the quantity sense, but they're spread. There's many of them. But they just go in. It's like, okay, the warehouse. There's no British sentries anymore. Great. That's tonight. That's raided. Let's take the bullets. Let's take the artillery, whatever we need. There was a lot of from Spitfires to even, I think there were a couple. No, I'm not going to say it because I think it went on. But there was aircraft. I mean, there was aircraft that the Israelis were able to use as well. So basically, whatever they were getting and whatever they could get, they used. They used small arms, submachine guns, handguns from Czechoslovakia. Something I always point out to my students, which they kind of take some pride, a lot of pride in, especially the Czech students. Like, yeah. But they used whatever they could, and there was a lot of it though. So it could have been a Molotov cocktail. It could have been a trash can full of nails, but it also could easily have been, well, we've got one Spitfire that the Brits left over, and we're using that until it, blows up in the sky, or it could be, something else.
And did you read about Golda Meir buying the former Nazi Air Force? Did you ever read it? It's hysterical.
Actually, I didn't hear that one.
Oh, bro, this will blow you away. So she was, I think, 16, and she went over to the U.S. to raise money because they were getting their butts kicked. Right. And she came back with tens of millions of dollars. Nobody saw this coming.
Okay.
They bought every Nazi. So they were flying Messerschmitts by the end of the war. I swear to God, they were shooting Rugers. It was just so crazy to think. And they all wrote about this in their letters to their spouses, where it was like, I'm holding Nazi weapons to defend myself. And it was because Golda Meir.
That's ironic.
Oh, dude. Yeah. I shouldn't say it's awesome, but you get what I'm saying. It's like, this was the stuff made to kill us. Now we're using it. So they were literally, bro, honest to God, flying Messerschmitts at the end of the war, which is just a riot to think of.
Yeah. I didn't know that, but that's true.
If you get a chance, check it out. It'll blow you away.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that. But to piggyback onto a sentiment that you said about the Arabs kind of infighting, this also exposed, at least from a point of view of military strategy, where they were the weakest at, which was they didn't coordinate very well, and that gave Jewish defenses enough time to counter, So if there's going to be an attack by the Egyptians, at this particular location, they were able to counter it and then move reserves or move other forces around to, if it would be the Syrians next or if it would be the Jordanians, which, by another war, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later on, the Arabs tried to be a little bit better at that, but that was one of those contributing factors as to how they could, how they lost. Israel was able to concentrate their forces, basically then counterattack. When we're gonna they knock out Egypt, they turn, then they knock out Jordan, they turn, they knock out Syria, or it could have been in different order.
No, I think you got it right,
essentially bro. This is essentially what they're able to do, and then you're left with, okay, miracle of miracles, we've won, we've got a country, and what are we going to do now? And this leads into one of the most fascinating periods of early Israeli state kind of history for me, which is you kind of have this confluence of three things that are happening all at once. You have the literal creation of the Israeli government. What is that going to look like?
Yeah.
How is that comprised? What is it going to look like? What model are we going to use? We get the first real big wave of immigrants that are going to come, making Aliyah. They're making, the immigration move to Israel. And well, what do we do with these people?
Right.
We're not talking about a couple hundreds. We're talking about thousands that are
Right.
coming.
Right.
And essentially, I wrote this in the outline that I gave you. I mean, building paradise. You've got desert,
Yeah.
and now we're going to have to make a country out of it. Make a village out of it, make a city out of it. If you look at pictures of
Oh.
what became it's Tel Aviv, right? What's Tel Aviv now, and what it was.
Right.
They didn't call it Tel Aviv, but what was the village that existed there in 1948? What did it look like in 23? It's amazing. It's amazing what they were able to do, and in large part, it was David Ben-Gurion. Really is the guy I credit with this.
The most incredible human being.
He takes this idea of the pioneer spirit, and he links it to this biblical. God is telling us, go forth into the land, be fruitful and multiply. But this is what I'm giving you, right? Exodus, right? This is what I'm giving you the land, and this is yours, and now make it yours. And so we see here the creation really of the kibbutzim, the kibbutz movement, which is these cooperatives. Yeah, and but it's this pioneer spirit of, we can live in the city, but there's really not cities like we're used to,
right?
And we still would have to build the city. So why don't we go out and let's till the land and make something here, but that's also turn this little village into a town, into a city, into now a metropolis. And so it's that pioneer kind of movement, which is great during that time period. In large part, though, they're also really helped by, which also happens to be the first real big political crisis for Israel. It's almost before it begins, which is the German reparations in the 1950s.
Now, brother, do you mind if I interject real quick? Is that okay before we get to reparations? Because I'm excited about it, because I don't know anything. About my knowledge tends to stop. Well, anyway, one of the things I read that I thought was really interesting was it said Israel's land was actually pretty fertile, and Jews were master farmers forever. But when Arab control of it occurred, they were more interested in trade, and it wasn't that they were bad farmers, it's just they didn't have that interest. And it was and so the Jews found their first task was to start irrigation, and because Jews are master farmers, and that had always been their, rep in the Middle East. And that process of transformation, it wasn't that the Arabs neglected it. It was just, we're not farmers. We're traders, and we're, merchants.
And this goes, you can see this goes really back, even before the states of Israel, right? We're going centuries back when
King David.
There's only that 5 or 10%, of Jewish population. But they're farmers, and then you've got the Arab population, which is
and then if we
doing other things.
We'll take a little break just for a moment before we get into reparations. Okay.
Okay.
Can we pause it, sis? Okay, tell me when. Okay, we're back. It didn't seem like long to you guys, but Dr. Aaron actually wrote a book during that break. So what we'll do now is we'll wrap up this episode and then get us ready for the next one. So a super brief summary is in the aftershock of World War II. Numerous promises came into conflict that the UN had to resolve. Promises to some of the Arab states and promises to the Jews, and it resulted in a partition plan for the state of Israel, at which point, when it was formalized, it resulted in a war. In the words of one of my profs, the entire Middle East invaded Israel. And this 2-year war, I believe it was 2 years, resulted in a shocking, no one saw this coming, Israeli victory, which reestablished their homeland. The Israelis responded under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion and then Golda Meir later. She was the second PM, right, bro? I think she was. No, who was in? Well, anyway, someone in between them. They began a program of expanding out into the land they had by establishing farms and small communities, and they're basically building a country anew. How do you feel about? Okay, and so that's a quick summary, and it takes us to, I believe, 1950. When we get into German reparations. 50s. Okay.
Yeah.
So in our next episode, we're going to look at those German reparations, the 1967 war and the unification of Jerusalem. And if we can get into the Yom Kippur War, and I love your tagline, if I may, because I don't mean, I actually got chills when I read it, because I think I know where you're going to go, but I'm guessing. Quote, the Yom Kippur War and the end of illusions. I thought, wow, like, see, look, I got goosebumps because I think I know where you're going. And maybe, if we're feeling saucy, my bro, we might even get to Camp David in 79. So,
we'll try. We'll
see. Folks, just so you know, Dr. Aaron, I don't mean to, we can't pay him. He's doing this out of love and out of the goodness of his heart. And on behalf of all of us who are just growing exponentially, brother, because of your hard-fought wisdom, thank you to you and to your wife for sharing you with us. And like I told you at the break, I want to be clear, we're going to double what we paid you last time you were on. So you've got that going for you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And folks, what we paid him last time is nothing. So let's get that out there. So, okay, folks, don't forget, tune in next time, and we will continue this discussion. And on behalf of Dr. Walter and I, we hope you have a beautiful day. God bless you.